I say then that in entirely new principalities, where there is a new prince, one will find more or less difficulty in maintaining them according to the greater or lesser virtu of the one who acquires them. And since this event of transition from ordinary citizen to prince presupposes either virtu or fortuna, it would seem that either the one or the other of these two things should, to some extent, mitigate many of the difficulties. Nevertheless, he who has trusted less in fortune has held on to his position best. Things are made easier also by the fact that the prince, having no other state to rule, is forced to come and live there in person. But to come to those who by means of their own virtu and not by fortuna have become princes, let me say that the most outstanding are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and the like. And although one should not discuss Moses, for he was a mere executor of the things God had commanded, he should still be admired, if only for that grace which made him worthy of speaking with God. Okay, I want to comment on the last sentence, which I think presents a series of paradoxes and contradictions that need to be discussed. Okay, the idea that Moses is a mere executor is itself worthy of comment. The idea of executor is a term that has a number of different possible interpretations. On the one hand, it would appear that Machiavelli is suggesting that Moses is the person who hears passively commands and decrees issued by God, and then in accordance with God's will, which is stated in the commandments or the decrees, carries out that which God seeks to bring into being. Okay? But on the other side, it appears that even the term esecutore in Italian, in the Latin root, carries with it not simply someone who passively submits to the will of another and puts himself, his mind and body at the disposal of another, but also someone who, in a certain sense, may be necessary for the accomplishment of the action itself. That is, someone without whom an action could not take place. It's as if, in a certain sense, we must pose the question of why God needed an executor, an esecutore. And this is especially important in the case of Exodus, which is what we're talking about here, because it's very clear from the actions in Egypt that God is capable of bringing about plagues and all sorts of natural phenomena. And so the question becomes, why in this particular case does he need an executor of his will rather than simply being able to translate his will into a kind of reality? And so this gives Moses, who would appear to be, in relation to the other examples that Machiavelli gives, simply a passive follower, as the term esecutore implies in a certain way. It's derived from the verb to follow. A follower of God's commandments, it turns him into, instead, a necessary part of the project of realizing the liberation of the Hebrew people from Egyptian bondage. Okay, that's part of it. But the other idea is that I want to look at a bit more is that Machiavelli's use of mere executor of God's will seems to diminish the idea of the executor even more, that somehow to be an executor is to be below the status of the other princes who are able through their virtu to impose their rule on their people. But in fact, as we know, Moses is by far the most successful of all the examples, and the fact that he has this paradoxical status of both following but at the same time perhaps carrying out, or as the rest of the sentence is going to suggest, even has a role in formulating the things that God commands, makes him not less than the others, but in a certain way exalted over them. And I refer particularly to the end of the same sentence, which has been remarked upon by commentators, the grace which made him worthy of speaking with God, con Dio. And a number of readers have suggested that this is simply a sort of ironic gesture on Machiavelli's part, which diminishes the very importance of God at the moment that he's speaking about God, as if to invoke God in order to sort of push him to the side in the face of the realities that the prince must deal with. But I think it's much more complicated than that. I think that what we see is, instead of Moses being an executor who simply passively or even actively hears and then obeys God's commands, instead the end of the sentence implies that he is speaking with God, that is, that there's an exchange, or we might even say an encounter between Moses and God that makes possible the liberation of the Hebrew people, rather than God. And if we read the text of Exodus very carefully, it's not that God somehow picks Moses out of an enormous panorama of possible leaders of the Hebrew people. It's in a certain way that they encounter each other, that Moses, for reasons that in the text of Scripture, have nothing to do with God, that Moses intervenes to stop the killing of a Hebrew slave, flees Egypt, and that event is not described as either being a result of God's will, or even that God is watching Moses carrying out the action of killing the Egyptian slave master or fleeing into the desert. God is absent from that section, and it's also something that isn't really explained in terms of Moses' intention. There's no discussion of why, what thinking lies behind Moses' action of killing the Hebrew slave. So at that very moment, Moses kills the slave, has to flee Egypt. He sees that he's going to be in danger. He goes up into the mountains, there's a long story, and he is tending a flock and encounters God. And what's very important here is that God doesn't call out to Moses until he sees Moses turning towards the burning bush. So there's a kind of, it's as if Moses and God are separate, and God isn't in control of Moses' actions, and there's a kind of meeting between them that allows something to take place. And I think this sentence by Machiavelli captures the way in which what we might call grace, that is the favor or gift, which can have a religious meaning or not, that this is not something that necessarily comes from God, but rather is the consequence of the encounter between God and Moses in a particular place, a particular time, which will allow both of them to be revealed and to carry out the liberation of the Hebrew people. And I think also the idea of speaking with God, which commentators have said it must be ironic, because it sounds like, as one says, God is Moses' friend and they're having a conversation or something. But in fact, in a very, very important sense, in the text of Exodus, that's absolutely correct. It's not simply that Moses receives commandments that are delivered by God to him through a voice, okay? But it's also that Moses will enter into a series of deliberations with God, in fact, affecting the course of the order of things according to God's will, preventing God in many cases from destroying the Hebrew people when they turn to idolatry, etc. And again, it suggests that there is something already godlike, not in Moses, because Moses is not Jesus or something, but something divine emerges out of this encounter between the voice of God and Moses himself. And it's at this point that Machiavelli makes a very important statement about the relationship between fortuna on the one side and virtu on the other in the same paragraph. And he says that it's a striking statement that the fortuna may favor the actions of a particular prince, but for the prince to realize the gift of that favor, it's not simply enough that fortuna offer it to him. The prince must have the virtu, which is very difficult to define, the ability, let's say, to take advantage of that of fortuna, but that advantage, that taking of advantage, can't happen simply between virtu on the one side and fortuna on the other. There must be a moment which Machiavelli calls occasione, and it's this occasione that brings them together. And so, in a very interesting statement, very, very difficult finally, that without the virtu of the prince, the opportunity offered by fortuna will become spenta, will be extinguished. And without the opportunity, virtu, as he says, will come in vain. And so again, there are very precise conditions under which an encounter can take place. And there's something, I think, in Machiavelli's text that privileges over all the other examples of the princes endowed with virtu, the meeting of Moses with God, as if there is something divine, divine is a good word, in the power that emerges not necessarily from God, but from an encounter that gives the prince the power to effect profound change. And I think that that's the primary message, or one of the most important issues that emerges from this section of The Prince.